We want to welcome you again today to First Christian Church Sunday School class, and this will be for September 27, 2020. If you have not been able to see the first two, they should still be on YouTube, and you can watch them before you watch this one. It might help make this one make a little bit more sense, because today we are going to be looking into the book of Genesis, where we were last week. And we're going to be looking at chapter 3. And if you remember in the chapters are the very big numbers. They're referenced up here at the top of your Bible. The book of the Bible in the chapter that page is dealing with is up here at the top. And then the start of the next chapter, which is 3, is down here at the bottom. And we're going to be doing the story, which is the title, The First Sin and Its Punishment. And that's what we're going to talk about today. And if you remember from last week, we read about the creation story. I have a feeling Clementine's going to make a cameo appearance today. But we read both of the creation stories that were in Genesis 1 and chapter 2, which is the creation of the earth and the sun and the moon and all the animals and fish. And then the people, Adam and Eve, and how they were made, the Garden of Eden, and then, and then they were living in bliss, no problems, didn't have to work for their food, everything was provided. Now Clementine, she's getting rambunctious. They were just living in happiness with God. And then chapter 3 picks up, and we start to learn a little bit more about what life was like back then. We know that at that time, apparently animals were able to talk, because we start a story here where the crafty serpent, which we always think of as a snake, is talking to Eve, and apparently nobody is surprised by this. So the serpent's chatting Eve up, and they're kind of having a conversation. And it's clear from the story that both Adam and Eve knew that there was a rule there in the Garden of Eden, that they were allowed to eat of any of the fruit of the trees of the Garden of Eden, except one in the middle, the tree of good and evil, or knowledge, the tree of knowledge, I think a lot of people call it, that had beautiful fruit, and God asked them not to eat of that particular tree. And so Adam and Eve knew that rule, and yet the serpent comes up to Eve, and they're having a conversation, and says, "Oh, surely you won't die if you eat from that tree." And he twists God's words here when he says, "You'll be like God, for you'll know the difference between good and evil," which was technically true. If you did eat of it, they would know the difference between good and bad. But what was not true was that they wouldn't eventually die, because we know from Paul in Romans that the wages of sin is death. We don't learn that for another couple thousand years, but nonetheless, in the event, so Eve starts looking at the tree, and I suspect she starts looking at the fruit and realizing, wow, that does look like good fruit. And it talks about Adam being with her, and that Eve takes a bite, takes one of the tree. Maybe it was an apple, maybe just, well, all we know is it's a fruit. We'll just say it's an apple, because that's fun, and that's usually what you see in the paintings. And she takes a bite and gives it to Adam, who also knew the rule, knew he wasn't supposed to, but he did. So they both disobeyed God. And this is a good time to talk about the word sin. It's one we use a lot in church time to time. And sometimes we don't do a very good job of defining what that means. Well, to me, sin means when we do something or think something that God doesn't want us to do or think. It's against one of his rules. That's a sin. We separate ourselves from God by our choices. Sin is something we choose to do. We choose to disobey. It's not something that happened accidentally. It's but a conscious choice that we make. And here, Adam and Eve made a conscious choice to disobey the rule of God, and they ate from this tree. And then they committed the very first sin. And it was interesting because at this point, I know it's kind of silly to think, but they weren't wearing clothes, and that was normal apparently there. And as soon as they ate of the fruit, they realized they didn't have clothes on, and they were embarrassed by that for the very first time and started sewing like fig leaves together to make clothes. And so later that evening, or an evening, I love how the Bible says that they heard the sound of the Lord walking in the garden at the time of the evening breeze. I can't imagine what it's like to hear God walk. It's probably like thunder or something. Be scary, but they hid. And God kind of playfully said, "Where are you?" Of course, he knew where they were. And Adam says, I heard you were coming, and I ran and hid because I was scared. And he's like, "Well, what are you scared about?" Well, so they fess up that they had taken the fruit from the tree and took a bite. And he says, and I was embarrassed. Adam said, "I was embarrassed because I was naked." And God's like, "Well, who told you were naked?" So it became very clear what they had done. And eventually what Adam did, which is what a lot of people do when they get caught doing things they shouldn't have, he started to try to blame someone else, which was another sin, instead of taking responsibility for his own actions. So he tried to blame it on Eve. Eve did the same thing and tried to blame it on the serpent, the crafty serpent. Neither one of them wanted to take responsibility of their actions, kind of like my cat over here doesn't want to take responsibility for the fact that she's tearing up our scarecrow. That is a conscious choice, Clementine. Don't destroy the scarecrow, please. That's a rule. Clementine. Anyway, so God essentially punishes, actually even punishes the snake, which is interesting, or the serpent. Says you'll be on your belly and eat dust, and there'll be hate between you and mankind, which is true for me anyway. I hate snakes. And and then he talks about Eve, when women give birth, they'll have more pain because of this, and that man, you're going to have to till the ground for food that is no longer just going to be naturally provided. You're going to have to work for your food. And so some pretty significant consequences that happened from their sin. And then they were banished from the Garden of Eden forever. In fact, there was a cherubim, which is a fancy word for an angel, that was placed outside. Apparently there's like a gate to the garden, and there was a flaming sword that guarded the gate, which I would have loved to have seen. I bet that was neat. So this cherubim and a flaming sword, and they were banished, Adam and Eve, from the Garden of Eden, and had to go to a land where they had to work and plow, just so they would have food to eat and make clothes for themselves. And so that's some pretty tough consequences there for their actions. And that's true in our life sometimes. When we sin, there is a consequence that we have to pay. Even when we ask for forgiveness. And I have no doubt God forgave Adam and Eve for their sins. But that doesn't mean there's still not a consequence of it. And they paid a very heavy price for it. But God still loved them and still provided for them and made sure that when they did plow the ground, that food was provided, and with their hard work. So when we sin, when we do things God doesn't want us to do, we do need to ask for forgiveness. That's very important. We also need to understand there'll be a consequence, and we need to not blame others for our actions. We need to accept those consequences and just keep on knowing that God still loves us and will still provide for us, and move on. So that's our story of chapter 3. And now we want to talk a little bit about our workbook here, Finding Your Way Through the Bible. And hopefully you have worked up to page 33. And so we're not going to do as many pages today. I'm going to have you work from page 34 through 39 as we learn a little bit more about the Bible. But last week we've learned that there's 2 big sections of the Bible. It's got 66 books in all, but then you've got the Old Testament, which has got 39 books. And then the New Testament, which is from the Old Testament's like before Jesus was born. And then the New Testament is like from Jesus is born going forward for almost 100 years. And then it's teaching you how to find books in the Bible, and which I think are pretty neat, and giving you a little quiz here and there and how to look. And what the word Bible means, which is kind of neat, is a collection of books, because all of these are different books written by different authors in many cases, telling different stories. So I really hope you're doing this workbook. It's very well done, a lot of fun, and it doesn't take you long to find if you got your answer right. All you have to do is flip on the next page there. So anytime you see a line, like with a question there on the one page, if you flip to the next page within the darkened area on the next page, it'll give you the answer. So you can check and see how well you're memorizing the questions. And sometimes it asks the questions several times. And it's just a really fun way to learn how to use our Bibles. Our green Bibles here, which are the NRSV, the Children's Bible, which is a really good Bible. And I hope that you take some time to read chapter 3 of Genesis and decide for yourself what the story means. Don't take my word for it or the way I interpret it. Read it yourself. See what you think it means. See what you can get out of the story, because a lot of times people get their own meaning from the story, or they see something I don't that's very meaningful to them. So it's just about a page and a half. Wouldn't take you long to read, and it's really worth reading because it really describes these stories in great detail. And you just learn so much about the way it was back then and how different it was in some ways than it is now, and in some ways how it's the same, how some things have never changed. So, on the workbook, pages 34 through 39 this week, if you get a chance. And I look forward to seeing you next week.